Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and we're very glad you're joining us again today. Today we're going to have another very interesting show. We have with us the author of this book, Exception to the Rulers, Amy Goodman, one of my favorite people, who's been on WBAI for, God, how many years at this point?
Oh, in fact, it's going to be 20th anniversary.
20th anniversary.
Right now.
Oh, fabulous. The well-known host of Democracy Now! That is aired on so many stations, WBAI, Pacifica Radio, Free Speech Radio, Link TV, Direct TV, and on it goes. It's actually the largest public broadcast that is even on channel, on PBS. Is that so?
Well, it's the largest public media collaboration in the United States.
In the United States. It's just fabulous, and it keeps reaching and growing larger and larger. And now Amy, with this book, has been nominated by the independent booksellers as the top title of a book during this election season. It's being translated into Spanish, Arabic, and many other languages, and it's really catching on worldwide, as it needs to. We're very glad to have you.
Oh, Amy. It's great to be with you.
Great. Wonderful. So, first of all, let's just go into one of the things that I've always wanted to just ask you, because of where you sit and the amount of news that you filter every day, you've developed a real historical perspective on what's going on in this world in general and in this country, of course, in particular. What is your sense of the underlying purpose of the kind of degeneration that we continually see from administration to administration going on? Because between democracy, the Democrats and the Republicans, it's almost seamless, nearly.
Right.
And I was just wondering, sitting where you sit, seeing the stories day after day, month after month, year after year, if you have some underlying sense of kind of what's up.
Yeah. Well, I think this point you raised between the seamlessness of the Democratic and Republican Party is a very important one, because it means we have no major opposition party in this country, which means that most people's voices are not heard, so that you can have a country where the Attorney General nominee is not challenged as he's confirmed in any significant way, and yet he is central to what has taken place at the Abu Ghraib prison in Guantanamo, the torture of prisoners, which not only endangers those people, but of course endangers U.S. servicemen and women when they go abroad, because it's very hard to hold another country accountable for prisoners of war and how they're treated when the U.S. is treating prisoners in such a horrific way, the famous pictures at Abu Ghraib. And that's just one small example. But even going to war, the invasion of Iraq, the fact that it was supported, by, though there are some Democrats who opposed it, the leading Democrats, like the Democratic Party candidate for president, John Kerry, and his running mate, Senator Edwards, they supported the authorization of the invasion. And this is a very serious issue, because you not only have a political landscape where the major parties don't represent most people, but then you have a media that acts as a megaphone for those in power, excluding everyone else. And that is a very serious problem. And so most people in this country, their views are simply iced out. And yet, what is hopeful is that there is grassroots activism everywhere. And you can't just classify it as progressive or conservative, Republican or Democrat, because those lines are breaking down. People care about what's happening in the world. I think this devastating tsunami shows that.
Yes.
That when finally the media reflects the stories of everyday people, people in this country care. And they open their hearts, they open their wallets, they do anything they can to help people that they see suffering. Well, we need that to happen on a regular basis, especially in countries that are deeply affected by U.S. foreign policy, to see what's happening on the ground, because people in this country are compassionate, if they know. We should see the same stories of people who've lost loved ones in Iraq, and then people in this country would say no. as they have even when they don't see it.
Mm-hmm. And they have, exactly. Your points are so well made, and this grassroots media growth that is taking place, in a sense, because there is such a corporate media blackout, it's pushing and encouraging, through polarity, the growth of alternative media.
Oh, I mean,
because the voice needs to be expressed, the truth needs to be said. And people, I see one of the ways, because of where I sit, illnesses growing like mad, stress-related disorders showing up. It's just so enormous at this point. And all of these are symptoms of being deprived of the truth and being propagandized. And that's sort of just another vantage point to look at the phenomenon of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, the truth will out some way or another.
Indeed.
But the media has erected a very strong sound barrier that has to be overcome. I mean, we can't minimize the power of the media. More powerful than any bomb or missile, the Pentagon has deployed the U.S. media. Absolutely. And that has to be challenged. We have to unembed the media, because these small group of owners who have consolidated so much power by buying up so many channels,
exactly,
they are using our airwaves. They are the public airwaves. Like, we wouldn't say if we're driving on the highway, oh, this area here is owned by AT&T. They can do what they want here. And then this is owned by Verizon. And no, the highways are public property.
That's right.
In the same way the public airwaves are. And they have a responsibility to include everyone's voices.
Absolutely true. And yet, that's not going on. And yet, we know that the corporate owners of the media, of the main stations, are actually military contractors. I mean, there are such blatant
right. I mean,
conflicts of interest, and yet these go unspoken. Not, except that's why we love you, because you're such a large voice in the public, saying it here in the book and everywhere you go to speak.
Right. I mean, on Democracy Now!, it's our point is to build independent media throughout the United States, whether it's television, whether it's radio, whether it's on the internet, to draw people to these independent sources of information. I mean, Democracy Now! Is a daily, grassroots, unembedded, independent, international news hour. Yes. And it's on Pacifica, which is such a sacred place, on NPR stations, on PBS, on public access TV, where you broadcast, which is also such a precious place. But truly, for people who watch public access but may not be familiar with Pacifica, Pacifica was founded 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, by a conscientious objector in World War II, very relevant to today, who came out of the detention camps. His name was Lou Hill, and said there's got to be a media outlet that is not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. And there are 5 Pacifica stations in Berkeley, KPFA in Los Angeles, KPFK in Houston, KPFT, WBAI, where we come from in New York, and WPFW in Washington. And you talk about military contractors owning networks. I don't think people are aware of this. But you, for example, look at what was happening during the Persian Gulf War more than a decade ago. You have, at the time, General Electric owned NBC. It still does.
Yes.
You had Westinghouse owning CBS. It's now owned by Viacom. Westinghouse and General Electric, 2 of the major nuclear weapons contractors, making most of the parts for most of the weapons in the Persian Gulf War. And I don't think it's any accident what we see as a military hardware show. And they're misusing the airwaves.
I think one of the most important points for us to kind of digest as a society is that we live in a war-based economy. And that means that when there isn't war, the economy isn't doing as well. Or certainly select major figures, players in it, aren't doing well. I've been arguing for years to rebase the economy on a health-based economy, on an environmentally based economy, so everything can be eco-sustainable, and as far as I'm concerned, I understand the money machine. I understand there are those interests that want to make just gobs of money. Okay, let's even just say that's okay. However, there's a way of doing it that is people-friendly and eco-friendly, instead of destruction-based.
Right. I mean, sustainability is the issue, and what we're engaged in now, obviously, is not sustainable. And We are, for those people who are diehard capitalists, free market is not happening right now when it comes to war. We're talking about corporate welfare to the nth degree with Halliburton and Bechtel and these no-bid contracts and these few corporations making their killing off the killing. This isn't about the growth and the thriving, the health of small businesses, either in Iraq or here at home.
Very true. Now, why do you think that John Kerry, for instance, did not make more of a deal of the coziness of Halliburton with the United States government and Iraq?
I think he's sorry now because he made a fatal calculation. And I was saying this in speeches all the way through that last year leading up to the election. We couldn't know then if it was a fatal miscalculation, but for democracy it was. And that was, if you're going to have an opposition candidate, they got to oppose the other side. And his calculation was, well, he would appeal to the same base that Bush appealed to, and he would try to peel some of Bush's support away. He would move farther and farther to the right. And his calculation was everyone to the left of that, would have nowhere else to go and would vote for him. But that is not true. People do have somewhere else to go. People simply don't vote. A lot has been made of the fact that many more people came out to vote in this election than before. It's true. But still, what are we talking about? 60%. We're dead last in the percentage of people who can vote voting. The fact that so many people did not come out to vote, almost half, that's inexcusable. And the reason, though, it's not that it's inexcusable for them. It's that for the candidate not to have presented a different picture of the world, they thought, why bother? And that is a disservice to a democratic society.
Very true. Not to mention to the Democrats in this particular case.
Because the Democrats did not represent a true opposition. And people thought, why not vote for the real Republican?
Exactly. What do you think really happened in Ohio and New Mexico?
Well,
what is your sense? Really?
Yeah, and it goes beyond, I'm glad you said New Mexico, because it goes beyond Ohio and New Mexico and Florida and many states throughout this country, because we don't
closely
really
to your
know.
show.
Right, and we don't really know. That's the problem. When you have this undermining of democracy through suspicion, and it's so easily resolved. All you have, as we increasingly have computerized voting machines, is a verifiable election. They got it in Venezuela. And they get their voting machines from Florida, from Boca Raton, Florida. When they recently had their election, you have a computerized voting machine, and you get a little ticket, like a movie ticket, a stub,
a receipt,
and you drop it in a box. And then you can do random tests throughout the country where you take what's in the box and you compare it to the voting machine, and you make sure that it adds up. Not in this country. For years, a bill has languished in Congress that simply asks for a paper trail. We've got receipts. If you gamble from ATMs, they're easy. All the companies say it would be very easy to retrofit. Yes. Why isn't it that the most important act that people can engage in, deciding the course of their country, that we cannot have a paper trail? If you don't, even if the election is accurately counted and accounted for, how do we know?
That's right.
This cannot go on in this way. And then you have egregious problems that happened in Ohio. You have the situation where there were, 638 eligible voters in one county, and more than 4,000 of them voted for George Bush. 638, more than 4,000 voted for Bush. But the bigger deal, bigger than any particular precinct, one of them, the county head commissioner, the person in charge of the elections, when they were going to add up the votes at the end of the day, and everyone watches, the news directors and news media is there and everything, they throw everyone out. And when challenged on this in the days that followed, she said the reason they did is that they had been approached by the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, and they had told them that this area represented a number 10, the highest possible national security threat, a number 10 security threat. well, when this was exposed, she wasn't supposed to tell this to the public. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security denied they'd ever approached them. But that leads
This
to great
little town in
suspicion.
Ohio
Yes, represents
is a
the
number 10.
one. Yes, number
Right.
10.
I thought
right.
about that. I was scared for my life.
But the bigger issue is actually not even when you once get to the polls. It's all of the harassment and intimidation in a system in this
Especially
country.
of minorities.
Right, that makes it difficult even for people to register, let alone vote.
Yeah.
The fact that, especially in communities of people of color, there weren't enough voting machines. The question of where were the provisional ballots. Students being told they're not allowed to vote at their universities, but they had to go back home in Arizona if they live in California. And that wasn't true. And yet over and over again, the message put out, or that you need ID, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
And
Intimidation
these
of
were the issues that
voters.
can't be as easily quantified, but it was going on in a systematic way all over this country. This is a very serious violation of what we're supposed to be doing in this country and the voice
Very
that's
true.
supposed to be representative of everyone.
The irony also, just to add insult to injury, is that even if all of the popular votes were counted correctly, even if by people who are outspokenly biased, who own the voting machine companies like Diebold, etc., and they
Referring to Walden Odell, who headed
Exactly.
Diebold, which is the company in Ohio
Yep.
that makes computerized voting machines, and he said in the year
Publicly.
leading up to the election, right? He said, "We will deliver the votes to Bush." And then you have Ken Blackwell, the Ohio Secretary of State, where, I mean, it's amazing that there isn't a law in this country that says that the secretaries of state, the people who run the elections, have to be impartial. He is a fierce partisan, runs the Bush-Cheney campaign in Ohio.
Exactly.
And actually, after the election, puts out this letter on his own letterhead saying he's running for governor, saying that he's very proud to have delivered the votes to Bush, that he's running for governor and soliciting funds. This is on the Secretary of State letterhead.
Exactly. It's unabashed. I mean, that's as scary and scarier than anything. They're not even embarrassed about the obvious conflict of interest.
Well, you know about the big lie. You have to go
Yeah.
right out there and you keep repeating it over
Exactly.
and over and over.
As you quote in Goebbels here in the book, that great quote that you're just talking to now. Exactly. If you tell a lie big enough and long enough, people just simply start to believe it.
Right, and when people ask, I was recently speaking to a group of women editors and publishers, and they're saying, how did we come to this point?
Yeah.
Well, let's look at the newspapers and the press of this country.
Yeah.
People aren't stupid. People are good media consumers, and when they see over and over again on the front pages of the New York Times, on the networks, top billed stories, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, not just Fox, weapons of mass destruction, over and over. Yes, they come to believe it, and
They
it's
start to
why
believe.
most people have believed this.
Yeah.
And this is the big scandal. We hear about Dan Rather going down, though he wasn't fired, having to leave as anchor of CBS because he did a anti-Bush story. There were questions about, this particular story and all the people around him, some of them having to leave. And it's good that there's an investigation done, but there really needs to be an investigation done of a much bigger story, which is every single network continually putting forth the rationale for the invasion, terrifying people in this country, talking about weapons of mass destruction when the evidence wasn't there. And now, just in the last weeks, quietly, the hunt is completely called off
For
weapons of mass destruction. And even the most hawkish inspectors, weapons inspectors, like David Kay, who was so frequently quoted believing there were weapons, when he came back and said, there weren't. We hardly hear anything about that now.
Yeah.
All of the papers, all of the networks need to be investigated for the true story about why they focused on this one issue. And even though there was a great deal of dissent, iced out that dissent. The New York Times, with Judith Miller, the national security correspondent, and her colleagues continually putting forth these stories, that's where the true investigation needs to be done.
Absolutely. Now, what happens when, for instance, the gentleman, the lawyer from the Center for Constitutional Rights,
Michael Ratner,
Michael
president.
Ratner, exactly. He is suing this administration almost constantly, you know,
That's
and
right.
there are many other groups that are doing similarly. Whatever happens to those cases?
Well, I mean, for one thing, we've just heard about at Guantanamo a number of prisoners being
released from England,
and
yes.
so slowly but surely, I think policy does change. They hardly get any attention, so it's fair to ask that question.
Yes.
I mean, Michael Ratner goes back to the HIV detention camps at Guantanamo Bay at the height of the coup in Haiti, when Haitians were fleeing a coup. Unfortunately, coup leaders on the payroll of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, they were fleeing the violence, and many of them would be stopped at Guantanamo, and they were put into these HIV detention facilities. And Michael Ratner in the Center for Constitutional Rights was challenging the constitutionality and the horror and the brutality of these camps. Ultimately, they were closed down. So change does happen. We don't hear about it very much. Yes, the Center for Constitutional Rights is suing Donald Rumsfeld. They filed a suit in Berlin,
Germany, right?
in Germany, and now more people are being released from Guantanamo. And I think that's quietly going to happen. That we have to look at how many other secret detention facilities are going to be set up all over the world, with prisoners sent to countries that engage in torture and where it would be acceptable to do that, but the U.S. involved with this, as we've heard about the torture jets, the torture flights of bringing prisoners to countries like Yemen, like Saudi Arabia, like Syria that engage in torture.
Exactly.
Egypt as well.
Exactly. What are we going to do?
I think we're going to
Is it that
build
our
independent
small
media.
voice is the media building that you're referring to, our alternative media, going to be the thing that actually catalyzes people to see that their democracy is actually slipping away from them rather quickly?
Yes, I think independent media is the hope. It is the key arena where people can speak out. It is the level playing field. It is.
Do you see that being threatened by Patriot Act 2, or even not by law, but by the general ambiance of the country at this point?
Oh, I think we are facing very serious times right now, which is why it is so important to focus on each individual case of a person who's wrongly imprisoned, a person who is detained without charge for years.
Yes.
Because, well, we know the famous quote from the pastor Niemöller. First, they came for the socialists. I was not a socialist, so I did not speak up. They came for the trade unionists. I was not a trade unionist, so I didn't speak up. They came for the Jews. I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't speak up. They came for the Catholics. I wasn't a Catholic, so I didn't speak up. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up. The media is important as a place where we can hear people's voices and stories, tell their stories if they cannot tell their own until they can. I really do think that people identify with other human beings, and if we are not part of that media blockade, but part of striking it down and building up alternative media, that really is the hope. I think we have to challenge the corporate media because they're using public property, and we have to build up our own, whether it's on the internet. For us, it's democracynow.org, and there's so many wonderful sites there on the internet, but we have to use it or we're going to lose it. We have to build up public access TV all over the country, satellite TV, radio, and support Pacifica and independent media all over the country as well.
I think that's what we've got to do. This is the way. As I watch what's going on in this world, it's just, I get sadder and sadder and sadder, you know. It's a profound thing that's going on. And I want to come back to the question that I originally asked. It's almost as though there is a plan. Another very interesting thing that I observed really at this point in the early 90s, 15, some years ago, when I started studying sovereignty and what sovereignty really meant in this country originally, according to the original blueprints of this country. And I found myself being friendly with people that were really people I would never have hung out with. They were not hippies. They were right-wingers, basically, in the seeming sense that small government, like libertarians and all. It was very interesting because there was a tremendous affinity between people who wanted freedom people who were just sort of peace-loving, freedom-loving people, and this group of our society, which were considered right-wing. I don't mean in the ordinary neocon sense, but I mean in a sense that they wanted to live their lives freely with a sense of sovereignty. Now, these groups are getting closer and closer together, being forced to by what I consider rather radical politics of the Bush administration. There's nothing conservative about it. It's utterly, completely over the top, I mean, based on what I see.
Oh, yeah, no question.
But one of the things they keep saying from these folks that I used to kind of read is there is a plan, you know, and yes, it's called conspiracy theory and all of this stuff, but I think we're far beyond that. There has been such a debilitation of this country for decades now. And we see it's like, and it's an international activity. I'm just wondering what you see, Amy, when you look and you see this continuing. Are they looking just for money? Are they looking just money and power? What's the game plan? Where does it leave us? Because it's destroying our planet. It's destroying the air. It's destroying the water. They have children too, you know, the owners of Monsanto. You know, what is it about?
Well, I think that they have barriers erected between the source of the destruction, companies, for example, like Monsanto, and feeling the effects of it. They're very far away from it.
So they're buffered.
And that buffer is the media. And again, going back to the tsunami, this epic global cataclysm, it really shows how we live in a globalized world. And when we hear about people suffering, how we care. It doesn't matter whether you're Republican, Democrat, conservative, or liberal.
Yes.
And what we have to do is to continue that globalization, not from the top down, but grassroots globalization. And that's what the internet can afford, can allow us to do, to communicate with each other. That's what global media allows us to do. The question is who controls it. As for what the motivation of those people are, I don't really care. What I care about is that we join together to protect the earth, that we join together to protect our own communities and help each other in that. The whole discussion of the tsunamis, first the U.S. was offering $400,000, then $4 million, then 15. It wasn't even a half of a third of what Bush was going to spend on the inauguration, and that's what they were offering in this time of just epic need. But what we find now is a solution in the problem. You not only have the effects of the tsunami, but the terrible effects of poverty in the world.
Yes.
The best long-ranging help to these countries would be relieving of the debt. And that means developing and developed countries joining together. And the debt being completely forgiven. And so that these people can help themselves instead of it going into the financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and all of the corporations that profit from others' misery. I think there are global solutions, and I think that they come from people at the grassroots level, and we need a media that gives voice to that.
Well, God bless you and the work that you're doing. We've been speaking with Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! You must tune in if you don't now, 99.5 FM or at mnn.org every Monday morning. And read this book also, because it really discusses in depth much of the coverage that she gives us every single day. Amy, my true heartfelt thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Absolutely. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week.